Meanwhile, the Trump administration immigration officials testified yesterday for the first time since federal agents shot and killed Alex Preddy and Renee Good in Minneapolis. Republicans on the House Homeland Security Committee were mostly supportive of the administration's immigration policies, but there was some pushback.
We have now seen the deaths of 2 American citizens in Minnesota. This is all unacceptable and preventable. The safety of law enforcement and the communities they serve and protect must always come first. When officials or elected leaders rush to conclusions about law enforcement or their fellow Americans, public trust suffers. There must be complete and impartial investigation.
Your officers are not trained to effectuate crowd control. They are trained to move in surgically, go in and remove these dangerous, violent criminals from the United States of America. I've called for de-escalation after the 2 deaths, the 2 shootings that took place. I believe that these roving patrols should be done at the border rather than in the major cities of the United States.
Acting ICE Director Todd Lyons and Custom and Border Protection Commissioner Rodney Scott both took defiant tones in their opening statements, then refused to comment on the deadly shootings.
Agents are increasingly facing an unprecedented level of aggressive interference and intimidation when executing the laws that you have asked them to enforce. These attacks on federal law enforcement personnel are coordinated and well-funded. This is not peaceful protest. No law enforcement officer should be put at personal risk simply for doing the job that we have asked them to do.
Let me send a message to anyone who thinks they can intimidate us. You will fail. Despite these perils, our officers continue to execute their mission with unwavering resolve, and we are only getting started.
Mr. Lyons, will you apologize to the family of Renee Good for being called a domestic terrorist by the president and his leadership?
No, sir.
Why not?
Sir, I welcome the opportunity to speak to the family in private, but I'm not going to comment on any active investigation.
Will you apologize to the family of Alex Preddy for also being called a domestic terrorist?
Sir, again, I'm not going to speak to any ongoing investigation.
Did the ICU nurse, Alex Preddy, deserve to die?
I cannot comment on an ongoing investigation, sir.
Do you believe that he deserved to die? Should he be killed by your agents?
I'm not going to comment on an ongoing investigation, sir, before it's concluded and all the facts are available.
They're so careful when they're under oath. Like, gosh, the administration just jumped on these people who were, a lot of people believe they were murdered by ICE. And medical examiners' investigations on it continue. The local investigations on it continue, despite the fact that the federal government, the people who spoke so quickly about Renee Good and Alex Preddy, took all the evidence and are denying the local officials and state officials from being able to do a proper investigation. Kristi Noem immediately lied about these. Steve Miller calling Alex Preddy a would-be assassin, and yet these folks here under oath are so careful not to talk about an investigation. Joining us, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. He's the ranking member of the Appropriations Subcommittee that writes funding for bills for the Department of Homeland Security. I'm curious, has anything happened in terms of returning the investigations back to the states and the evidence back to the states of these killings at point-blank range? Renee Good in the head, Alex Preddy in his back, multiple times. And do the raids and the detainments where people just disappear at times and are held in terrible conditions, do they continue? Has Tom Homan cleaned up the mess in Minneapolis as he promised he would?
So yesterday morning, ICE officers were patrolling bus stops in Minneapolis, hunting children. getting ready to send more kids like Liam Ramos down to inhumane detention centers in Texas. The detention center that Liam Ramos was in was closed down for a period of time because of a measles outbreak. That facility, Dilley, is called the baby jail because it houses not dozens of kids under 5, it houses hundreds of young children. And these kids are being terrorized. They're being traumatized on purpose. I'm glad that the story of Liam Ramos has risen to the level of broad public consciousness, but there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids whose lives are fundamentally changed because they are being thrown into horrific detention centers by this administration. Of course, there's no state investigation happening because they decided 2 minutes after Alex Preddy was murdered that those officers were not going to be held accountable. J.D. Vance told the world that these officers have complete immunity. And so these abuses are going to continue because the officers know that even if they commit a deadly mistake, no one is going to hold them accountable. There are still 3,000 ICE officers in Minneapolis, more police officers than are in Minneapolis today. ICE is still removing young children from their homes all throughout this country. Nothing has changed. Tom Homan hasn't changed any of the practices, and that's why the American people are just basically saying to us in Congress, do not fund this agency unless they change what they're doing, unless they stop terrorizing families and young children.
Senator, you took a trip to Texas to see these detention facilities for yourself. You were turned away despite the fact that you have a legal right to oversee those facilities. So you then instead went to the immigration court, as I understand it, in San Antonio just to see how the process works. Can you describe for our viewers what you saw down there?
Well, first of all, let me underscore what I didn't see. I went to this detention center that ended up being closed down because of the horrific public health conditions. I didn't show up unannounced. As you noted in the outset, I'm the top Democrat on the committee that funds the department. I gave them, a day and a half notice, plenty of time for them to open up the facility, and they refused because they are hiding something from all of us, from, not just leaders in the Senate, but taxpayers as well. So instead, I went to one of these immigration courts. It's important to note that at the immigration courts, you have immigrants who are playing by the rules, who are showing up for their court appointments, who are applying for asylum. These aren't people who snuck into the country. These are people who, many of them, literally came with an appointment to apply for asylum, and they're going through their process. The ICE officers stand outside the courtroom. In many cases, the DHS lawyers text the ICE officers when they know one of these immigrants is walking out the door, and then they get taken away and thrown in prison. Disappeared, essentially, because in these prisons, the lawyers have really no access to them. There's, 4 rooms for lawyers to meet with immigrants in a detention center that holds 1,800 people. That's happening every single day. And so, while we are rightly seeing these images of abuse in Minneapolis, in a place like Texas, you are having the law violated for legal immigrants to this country every single day at scale. And that should just freak Americans out, that this administration does not care what the law is. You may have your thoughts about, whether we should change the laws on how people are able to apply for asylum, but this administration is just making up the law when it comes to our immigration statutes, and it's just another sign of how lawless they are and how they do not give a crap about either the statute or the Constitution.
Senator, while you were there in Texas, you saw the ICE buses lined up outside the courthouse waiting to take the people away. And to clarify, these were people who are doing the process by the book, right? These are people who are doing what they are meant to do under the process. So what is now your option? You were denied access to the facilities. You did manage to meet some of the families down there who had been detained. As a senator of the United States Senate, what control do you and your colleagues have to try to get America back onto the right legal path?
Yeah, one of the families I met when I was there had just been released from detention. Again, the same facility, Dilley. And the father had been detained with his 2 kids. They didn't need to detain his 2 kids. Their mother was still at home. They could have released the children to the mother, but they chose to lock up the kids just for the purpose of terrorizing these kids. I sat with the kids for an hour. They were alive on the outside. They were dead on the inside. These kids just stared straight ahead. They had seen things in these prisons that they will never, ever forget. The bottom line is we have a constitutional obligation to only fund an administration that's acting lawfully. And so we should not fund the Department of Homeland Security if it is committing these crimes. Now, some people will say, well, they have all this money in the big, beautiful bill, the bill they passed last year. It's sort of a slush fund to continue operations at ICE, even if we don't fund it through appropriations. Well, that's true, but they can't immediately shift over all of their operations from appropriations to the big, beautiful bill. If we decided to stop funding them through appropriations because of their lawlessness, it would certainly slow these crimes, this abuse, and this lawlessness down. So that's the leverage that we have to say you're not getting funding from the appropriations bill until you start acting lawfully. And we are right now trying to get agreement with Republicans on a series of reforms that would make it a whole lot harder for them to abuse children like Liam Ramos and those kids that I met in Texas.
So, Senator, help me out here if you can. What you've described seeing in Texas, especially the facility where Liam was held at 5 years of age, when he's not one of the worst, as it's been always advertised by ICE that's who they're going over, the worst of the worst. So Liam and the other children in that facility with him have in effect been kidnapped. You are a member of the United States Senate, 100 strong, the House of Representatives, 435 strong. Are you telling us, the nation, that there is nothing you can do about this? Nothing?
No, of course, there are actions that we can take. But as you know, Republicans run the House and the Senate. And so in order to pass a piece of legislation that stops this lawlessness, ultimately, we need Republicans to join us. And right now, they are refusing to do anything to rein in ICE. We have legal routes as well. So as you know, many of us are raising money for the legal operations that were responsible in part for getting Liam Ramos out of jail. I frankly am starting to spend my own campaign money on these efforts because I just think, what's the point of having money in the bank as a politician if our democracy is dying? So I'm literally sending money to the groups in San Antonio that work to get kids like Liam out of jail. And then we can mobilize the public because Republicans will only come to the table to stop these abuses if they believe that they're going to lose an election this November if they continue to stand by and allow ICE to tear gas schools and murder American citizens. So we'll be working to help mobilize people to hold Republicans accountable, and maybe that will force them to the table. So, no, listen, it's difficult when you're in the minority in the House and the Senate. You don't have the presidency, but we are not powerless. And my colleagues shouldn't act like they are powerless. I mean, we should not decide to fund this agency based upon window dressing reforms. We have power to deny this department funding if they are going to continue to abuse and terrorize our kids.